The next time you feel overwhelmed and someone tells you to just talk about it, you might assume they're offering company in the discomfort. They're actually describing a neurological process that physically changes what happens inside your brain within seconds of doing it. Psychologist Matthew Lieberman at UCLA ran a series of brain imaging studies in the mid-2000s looking at what happens when people are shown photographs of faces expressing strong negative emotions. As expected, viewing these images produced measurable activation in the amygdala, the brain region most closely associated with threat detection, fear, and the biological stress response. The images triggered something real, not just psychological discomfort, but a physiological alarm running beneath conscious awareness. Then Lieberman added one variable. He asked participants to label what they were seeing, to assign a single word to the emotion visible in the face. Angry, scared, sad. The amygdala response dropped, not disappeared entirely, but measurably and significantly reduced within the same scan, in real time, simply because the person had attached a word to the experience. Lieberman called this effect labeling. He described it as putting the brakes on the emotional response, not through suppression, not through distraction, but through the specific act of naming. This was not what researchers expected. The prevailing assumption had been that directing attention toward a negative emotion would amplify it, that carefully examining your fear would make you more afraid. What Lieberman's data showed was nearly the opposite. Directed attention combined with precise language didn't deepen the emotional state. It disrupted the automaticity of it. The amygdala operates faster than conscious thought, faster than language, faster than any deliberate decision you can make, and yet it responded differently when language arrived. Neuroscientist Dan Siegel came to similar conclusions working at UCLA around the same period and gave the principle its most widely used name: name it or tame it. His observation, from both neuroimaging research and clinical work, was that generating a word for what you're experiencing activates the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for reasoning, planning, and deliberate regulation, in a way that competes with and dials down the subcortical alarm. The two systems pull in opposite directions. When language enters, reason gets a foothold it didn't have before. Lieberman's follow-up research reinforced how counterintuitive this finding is. In one study, people with spider phobias were brought into proximity with a live tarantula. Participants who verbally labeled their fear, describing in words how scared they felt, how large the spider looked, how much they wanted to leave, showed less physiological stress response and were able to approach the spider more closely than participants who used distraction techniques or who simply tried to think positive thoughts. Putting the fear into language worked better than trying not to feel it. The reason this matters beyond a single brain scan comes from the work of psychologist Feldman Barrett, whose research on what she calls emotional granularity reveals a striking pattern in how people fundamentally differ from one another in their emotional lives. Emotional granularity refers to how precisely a person can distinguish and name their own inner states. Someone with low emotional granularity experiences a broad, undifferentiated field of negative feeling. They know something is wrong, they know they feel bad, but they can't articulate much beyond that. Every unpleasant feeling collapses into one category. Someone with high emotional granularity experiences the same situation and can describe the texture of what's happening. Not just anxiety, but anticipatory dread with a specific edge. Not just sadness, but the particular hollowness of grieving something they never actually had. Barrett's research consistently finds that people with higher emotional granularity don't just describe their emotions more precisely. They regulate them more effectively. They're less likely to turn to alcohol or aggression in response to distress. They recover more quickly from stressful events. They make better decisions under pressure because they can tell the difference between emotional states that require entirely different responses. Having the word available isn't just a cognitive trick. It changes the architecture of the experience itself. Barrett also documented the opposite pattern. People with low emotional granularity, Those who experience most negative states as a single undifferentiated signal that something is wrong are more likely to engage in emotional blunting or to oscillate between suppressing feelings entirely and being fully overwhelmed with very little regulated space between. Without precise language, the available responses tend to be the bluntest ones: distraction, avoidance, or flood. The word, it turns out, is not just a description of the feeling. In a meaningful neurological sense, it is part of how the feeling gets shaped into something manageable. This connects to earlier work by psychologist James Pennebaker, whose expressive writing study showed that people who wrote in careful detail about difficult experiences, not just what happened, but specifically what they felt while it was happening, showed measurable improvements in immune function, reduced doctor visits, and lower anxiety scores over the following months, compared to people who wrote about neutral topics for the same duration. Pennebaker's protocol was simple: 15 to 20 minutes of continuous writing on consecutive days with emotional specificity. His control groups wrote just as long, but without emotional detail, and showed none of the same benefits. The variable that drove the results was the precision of emotional language applied to the experience. Finding words for what had happened seemed to help the nervous system integrate it, rather than leaving the experience circling unresolved in the background of daily life. The practical implication extends well beyond acute distress. Emotional vocabulary functions as cognitive infrastructure. A person with 20 distinct words available for negative emotional states has 20 different levers they can pull, 20 more precise signals about what's actually happening and what's actually needed. They can tell the difference between feeling overwhelmed and feeling helpless, which leads to different actions. They can distinguish loneliness from boredom, which are regularly confused and produce entirely different needs. They can notice that what they've been calling anxiety before a difficult conversation is closer to anticipation, and that realization alone changes their relationship to the moment. The evidence suggests this capacity can be deliberately built. People who expand their emotional vocabulary over time, through literary fiction, through therapy, through the consistent practice of naming states rather than just reacting to them, show measurable increases in emotional granularity. The word alone isn't magic. It does not erase the feeling. What it does is shift your relationship to the feeling from something happening inside you quite automatically and without your participation into something you can observe with just enough distance to decide what comes next. That distance between the feeling and the response is where almost everything we call emotional intelligence actually lives. Subscribe, because every single week we bring you one more finding about what's actually happening inside you and why the answers are almost never what you assumed.